In the summer of 1588, trouble was brewing in Europe. A poor country on the fringes had incurred the anger of the greatest empire in the world. Retribution was on its way. Setting sail was the Spanish Armada, the most powerful fleet ever seen. Its mission, to take England by force.
Spain was by far the greatest European military power. She had, by any reckoning, the finest army in Europe. So for most people, the idea of Spain being capable of actually invading England seems a real possibility.
Few believed the Armada could fail, but it ended in complete disaster. To unlock the puzzle of why the Spanish failed, archaeologists have joined forces with experts in ship design, oceanography, and early firearms. Is the answer to be found in 16th century weather patterns? Is it beneath the waves? Or could it be that what sunk the hopes of the Spanish Armada was a natural phenomenon that's still with us today? In 1588, the Spanish Armada fought the English Navy in the English Channel. Spain failed in its plan to invade England, and many ships were lost. For a country placing their strategy in God's hands, this defeat shook their faith to the core.
Colours party, ho!
In Britain, the defeat of the Spanish Armada is remembered as one of their greatest naval victories.
Make it so!
A David and Goliath battle, with the English triumphing against the odds.
Pipe the still!
The mighty Spanish galleons were defeated by superior seamanship, and their fleet was sent packing by a God-given change in the weather. These are the legends, but what is the truth? In search of answers, we begin at the end. This is where the Spaniards' high hopes finally came to grief, shipwrecked on the cold northern shores of the British Isles.
It's in places like this, far from Spain, far from the battles in the English Channel that were so important to the history of England. Here the real drama unfolded that settled the vital course of history in the late 16th century.
But how did the Spanish end up here? Colin Martin has spent his life diving these wrecks and piecing together the clues they surrender.
About 40 of the Armada's ships either foundered at sea or were driven on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland.
Upside diver 2.
What we're trying to do as archaeologists is reconstruct their lives. We're trying to make contact with them as fellow human beings and understand more fully the world that they lived in.
And the world that's revealed is rich and complex, a society at the height of its power and intent on the religious conquest of England.
An Armada wreck is particularly evocative in this respect because it contains everything. We have the noble jewels of aristocrats who were on a crusade, the everyday commonplace items of ordinary people, religious items, and we have the weaponry and the accoutrements of an invasion army.
Spain was the superpower of the age. Under its King Philip II, it had grown rich, colonizing countries in South America and making the most of their resources of silver and gold. Elizabeth I had long been a thorn in Philip's side, her country a rogue state, Protestant, poor and piratical. Elizabeth encouraged adventurers like Francis Drake to attack Spanish treasure fleets and cut her in on the proceeds. It was a dangerous game.
Elizabeth had spent 20 years provoking Spain on and off. At one moment she was a superb appeaser, the next moment she was belligerent. She was steering the ship of state through the most dangerous waters this country has probably ever seen.
And Elizabeth's politicking was about to hit the rocks with the execution of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. In his palace outside Madrid, Philip had long prepared an invasion plan. It was ambitious, deploying 2 separate armies. The Armada would escort the first from Spain to the English Channel. There they would combine with troops from the Spanish Netherlands. Together, they would land in Kent and march on London. Elizabeth knew of Philip's plans, but could offer little resistance. While he had 2 regular armies, she had none. Her part-time militiamen were no match for Spanish professionals. England's only defense was the sea and the ships of the Royal Navy. But how good were they? History tells us that ship design changed radically under Elizabeth. Now, using computer modeling, John Adams, an archaeologist, can see just how far-reaching those changes were.
The ships of the Armada campaign represents almost a revolution. The way ships are conceived, designed, constructed and used has completely been rethought. And the benefits of that rethink, effectively, are manifested in the ships that fight the Armada.
It's clear that the English warship had been completely reinvented. From the bottom up, they were more streamlined, what a new generation of ship designers called race-built.
Race-built refers to the profile that these ships presented. If you looked at them side by side, one is a great big, bulky, much higher, taller structure, whereas the race-built galleon has a much sleeker, lower hull. The performance analysis that we've carried out indicates that ships of the Armada campaign would have been considerably faster. We also see the rig, the thing that powers the ship along, that is also changed as well. So it transmits more power per square foot. This allows the ship to be used in ways that are much more inventive.
But against the might of the Armada, would these technological advances prove enough? Elizabeth's Royal Navy was about to be put to the test. As the Armada entered the Channel on July the 29th, 1588, the English saw for the first time the scale of Philip's invasion force. The chains of beacons had been long prepared.
The beacons were a traditional system of giving warning of seaborne attack. The mechanisms were very well organized. Districts or parishes were responsible for maintaining their beacons, keeping permanent watchmen and so on. And it was a very effective system. It would work in most circumstances.
England was crisscrossed by a complex network of vantage points relaying signals by line of sight. They could communicate only one simple, pre-arranged message, but they did so with surprising speed.
I've seen a calculation based on modern experience with lighting beacons that the message could probably have got from Plymouth to Carlisle, i.e. the northernmost frontier of England, in about 40 minutes.
As the beacons flared, there was trepidation among the English in Plymouth. What would the Spanish do?
All they were confronted with was this enormous fleet. Nothing like it had been seen in the Channel since Roman times. So finally, the great forces of the Antichrist, as they would look at it, had arrived in the Channel in strength.
But the Channel is a capricious stretch of water, and in the age of sail, both sides were at the mercy of the elements. Every twist and turn in the battle to come would depend on the vagaries of weather, tide, and current. 4 centuries later, is it possible to pinpoint the weather faced by the Armada? On the coast of Northern Ireland, where many Spanish ended up, Ken Douglas, a self-taught meteorologist, believes that it is.
The weather certainly was the key. There wasn't any secret about that, but nobody had actually tried to put it together in modern meteorological terms.
Ken Douglas has used the ship's logs from the Spanish and English fleets to piece together a picture of the daily weather observations for 1588.
I could see from that there was information there giving us wind speeds, whether it was raining, etc., wind directions, and it seemed logical just to put those on a map and see if it was possible to turn those into some kind of synoptic charts.
A synoptic chart is a standard weather map showing high and low pressure areas in the atmosphere. In areas of high pressure, the winds rotate clockwise. In low pressure areas, anti-clockwise. Knowing the ship's positions and their recorded wind directions, Ken could calculate the weather throughout the entire campaign. Now, for the first time, this data can be combined with computer images to create a daily weather map for the Armada.
From the period after they entered the Channel, the luck seemed to favour the Spaniards. A high pressure cell developed to the northwest, and in high pressure the winds circulate clockwise, so that the wind would be from the west. It also produces good weather, and it stayed with them the rest of the week.
Everything favoured the Spanish. They were in open sea with the wind behind them. At anchor in Plymouth, the English were a sitting target. Yet when Sir Francis Drake was warned of the threat, he is said famously to have shown more concern for his afternoon sport than for the approaching Spanish.
This was a dramatic moment. This was the Spanish fleet of 130-odd ships found in the western approaches just off the Lizard. Drake's response is one of cool, calculated, phlegmatic dismissal, that there is plenty of time to deal with this enemy and finish the game of bowls. Whether it's absolutely correct, we don't know, but it works. It's a piece of theatre and it's gone into the Armada legend.
But why did Drake do nothing? Looking at the tide patterns for that July day, Steve Hall, an oceanographer, reckons he simply had no choice.
It's possible to predict quite accurately what the state of the tide and the current flow would be. And we can see that if Drake had been wanting to finish his game of bowls, there wasn't really anything he could do until 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening anyway, because of the state of the tide. There was no way of getting those ships into the English Channel.
The English lay helpless, but the Spanish made no attempt to strike. Their commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had orders to keep strictly to Philip's battle plan.
18,000 Spaniards ashore in Plymouth would have been quite a headache for us. Fortunately, the Spanish orders were so inflexible that this golden opportunity that the Duke of Medina Sidonia might have taken advantage of was missed there for Spain.
An opportunity which the English seized as the tide turned. Upwind, the Spanish were still confident, but they were about to be confounded by the quickness of the English warships.
Because the English ships were capable of sailing much closer to the wind than the Spanish thought, to their horror, the Spanish found the English ships working their way behind them, ahead of them, around their fleet, and getting into tactically advantageous positions that they hadn't anticipated at all.
The Spanish ships couldn't compete, They were solidly built, but lacked the nimbleness of the English.
We have two images here. One is generically English type of galleon, and another is a reconstruction of the San Diego, a Spanish galleon. Just in looking at the two profiles, you can see that the English hull form is slightly more compact. The castle structure is a little bit lower. The Spanish galleon has a much longer forward raking stem, a shorter keel by comparison, and a much more angular rake in the sternpost. And perhaps some of the differences that we see are part of the reason why the performance of the English ships in 1588 so surprised the Spanish.
The English had used the maneuverability of their ships to seize the advantage of wind and weather from the Spanish. Now they could dictate tactics.
The important thing about gaining the weather gauge or getting upwind of the enemy is it gives you total flexibility of maneuver. You can either attack or pull away as you will. Those who are downwind really have to react to what you're doing. They're not in a position to really do much about it. You can drop down from upwind on them. It's very hard for them to claw their way back up to get at you.
It was the Spanish who were vulnerable now, but they responded quickly. They switched into the defensive crescent formation used by their treasure fleets.
The Spaniards were very experienced at organising defensive convoys. They'd been doing it for a long time. And it was a good formation. The English could really only attack the trailing wings where the main Spanish warships were stationed. They couldn't safely penetrate into the gap between because it would have been too easy for them to be trapped by the Spanish ships.
The Spanish expected that any fighting would be at close quarters. That was how sea battles had always been fought. But the English had a new kind of warfare in mind. They intended to sink the Spanish at long range.
What was new was that the English were carrying into action much heavier gun batteries than anybody had done before. And the Spaniards were well aware of this, and they were intensely concerned that they were going to find themselves facing a weight of gunfire which they couldn't possibly match.
And this was the weapon the Spanish feared most. The long-barreled cannon known as the culverin, or snake. To the English, it was a ship killer, but would it prove the decisive factor in sinking the Spanish?
Culverins are characterized by having these long, slender barrels in relation to their caliber. The caliber of this gun's about 5.5 inches. The reason for this long proportion is probably because they believed that you get the maximum benefit from the burning powder charge in the long barrel, and it would probably fire quite accurately as well. But it's a high velocity weapon. I mean, we're getting a very fast moving cannonball going more or less straight where you aim it.
For the Elizabethans, it was a super weapon. But how deadly was the culverin? Nick Hall is about to put this replica to the test on a modern firing range. '16th century gunnery was a black art with few scientific principles. Gunners worked by trial and error, and their knowledge of ballistics was limited. But on paper, the culverin appeared formidable, with a range of over 600 yards at 0 elevation.
Okay, distance is 307 metres over.
Nick Hall and his colleagues are examining these claims using 21st century tools, high-speed cameras and Doppler radar.
Undercover!
Gun ready.
Stand by. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
The culverin's opening shot is well over a quarter of a mile, already close to the performance claimed by the Elizabethan gunners.
Did you get that muzzle velocity?
No.
408 meters per second, and the distance for the long-range warm-up shot was 477.8 meters. So 477.8 meters. I mean, that's good. So that's almost horizontal, isn't it? And that's nearly the range that Born in 1587 is saying with 666 yards.
Yeah.
What those early gunners could not have dreamed of measuring was the speed of the cannonball leaving the muzzle. At over 400 meters a second, the 24-pound iron shot is traveling at above the speed of sound. The culverin, then, has a powerful reach, but how accurate is it? We know that the Spanish feared above all the sharpshooting of the English gunners.
Philip II briefed his commanders that the English would try to shoot low. They would try to damage the Spanish hulls, ideally just below the waterline.
So what do you think we are? We're slightly left?
Well, I thought
Slightly right.
we were slightly right, but
aren't we?
It's time to try the culverin against a target, just 10 feet square, but the thickness of a ship's hull. The target is 150 meters away, the gun barrel dead level.
3, 2, 1, fire!
But the cannonball flies high.
on the negative side, we missed the target by an appreciable amount, but we would have had a very good hit on the ship.
It was well within the bounds of the ship, wasn't it?
Yes.
Striped markers indicate the overall length of the imaginary ship, but only a direct hit on the woodwork will produce real damage. Wooden galleons were surprisingly hardy, as the Elizabethan gunners soon found. It was one thing to hit the enemy, but to sink them needed repeated shots on target. Accurate and consistent fire at a time when most sailors had no knowledge of maths or science. Our present-day gunners have different problems. 21st century know-how ought to give them an edge, but their mental arithmetic seems to confuse even them.
We reckon it was about 6 foot higher, so we want to come down about 12 feet, don't we?
Well, that's
4
not
meters.
30
4
centimeters,
meters.
is it?
4 meters. Want to come down?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's that in mils?
4 meters in mils.
4,000.
That range.
A mil sub 10's a meter at 1,000, so at 100 it's sub 10.1 of a mil.
I'm sure you're right.
The logic is clear enough. If the shot is flying too high, the gun must be lowered. But the muzzle's already below horizontal.
About there?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
Amazingly, even with the gun pointing down, the shot is still going skywards. The experts agree to aim lower still.
The shot went straight over the top of the target, and I saw it impact in the ground at about 1,000 meters. So it's gone well over the top of the target. So we'd actually need to lower the elevation quite considerably, I think.
But in reality, how much more would you depress a gun?
We'd probably want to come down almost 100 mils, so we were looking at bringing it down about 4 or 5 degrees.
But the radar will tell you whether it's hit.
Respect is rising for the English gunners of 400 years ago. It's hard enough to aim the culverin on dry land, let alone on a pitching warship in full sail.
Well, is this it?
That's it, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, that's perfectly in line. Look at it.
And suddenly recognition dawns. The reason that the shot is flying high is staring them in the face. A telltale track where it's ricocheted off the ground.
Why don't we split the difference?
Well, maybe we just leave it where it is.
We're sure this happened from this firing and not one of the earlier ones.
Yeah, because we haven't
certainly
seen this
happened on this one yet.
What did the radar?
Belatedly, the 21st century gunners realize they've been aiming too low all along. It's time to beat the retreat.
So what we've done now is effectively raised the gun by 40 minutes. So 40 minutes is about 10 mils. So therefore, theoretically, we should raise it 1.5 metres on the target. That would be 10 metres a kilometre. So that would be 1 metre.
They're averaging just one cannon shot an hour, with as yet no hits. The Elizabethan gunners managed exactly the same rate of fire, but even after 6 days at sea, they too had made little impression on the enemy. And such heavy long-range shooting had used precious powder and shot.
Of course, one of the big questions is why the English fleet, or the Royal Navy, was so relatively ineffective. It had the advantage of the weather gauge, it had the advantage of the fast manoeuvrable ships, it had the advantage of heavy artillery, yet had to break off the attack because it was using up too much ammunition, and it had had very little to show for itself.
It was round one to the Spanish, and with English hopes crumbling, the way was now open for the Armada to follow through with its long-planned invasion. In Flanders, the soldiers of the Duke of Parma were waiting. These were the crack troops that would lead the Spanish invasion of England. All that was needed was the ships to get them there. Out in the Channel, the Armada had left their English pursuers trailing. But a crucial flaw now appeared in the Spanish invasion plans. Their commander, Medina Sidonia, discovered there was no port large enough for him to take Parma's army on board.
Medina Sidonia was clearly extremely worried about what the outcome would be, because he didn't really see how this vital link-up with the Duke of Parma was actually going to take place. He began to realize that total disaster was in the offing.
For 6 days, the Spaniards had run the gauntlet of English firepower in the Channel. Now they had no choice but to heave to in open sea. They were at anchor and vulnerable, and the weather was turning.
The Armada's luck was beginning to run out. They had had a good time coming up the Channel as far as wind was concerned, but as the day progressed, they came under the influence of low pressure to the northeast, and that produced northwest winds which got stronger all the time.
And it's now clear that it wasn't just the weather that was beginning to conspire against the Spanish.
It's a full moon, we're going to have some very strong tides with strong tidal flows, and the Spanish wouldn't really be able to get out, certainly not in formation. We're coming up to the evening, we see it gets to 8:30, 9 o'clock, the tide changes. Strong tides, about 3 knots. And so these ships would have been pinned against the coast at the mercy of the wind and the tide and the English.
The English had a plan. A handful of ships would be sacrificed. Soaked in pitch and set ablaze, they would become weapons of terror, carried on the rising tide deep into the Spanish fleet. With their defensive shape broken, the scattered Spanish troopships made easy targets. For the first time, the English could now close on the enemy.
This is the point at which the English started firing at very close range. And this is the point, it's clear, when Spanish ships are beginning to suffer serious damage and heavy casualties.
At long range, the English guns had been ineffective. Now, at close quarters, they proved fearsome.
We are beginning to see, I think, enormous damage being inflicted on the Spanish ships. Their decks have been raked by round shot. Swathes of splinters are scything through men. Anything with soft tissue is being cut down and severely damaged. Rigging, structures of the boat are being smashed. The Spanish effectively are taking a terrible pounding at this stage, and the hammering is getting worse, getting more and more intense.
Yet while the English were out shooting the Spaniards, they still had difficulty sinking them. Medina Sidonia's flagship was hit 200 times but kept sailing, and the English powder and shot were almost spent.
They were firing, in comparison with the Spaniards, much more quickly, much more effectively, and causing real damage to the Spanish ships. But it was relatively limited. They just didn't have the ammunition stocks to keep up the continuous attrition which is necessary to physically disable or sink a wooden ship.
Quite frankly, there was not enough firepower going down to stop the Armada. We could not put enough weight of fire into various vessels to slow them down. Otherwise, we would have expected far higher casualty rate.
Go to slightly more elevation, it's not a problem.
7 degrees?
Even at close range, it seems, the English still had a problem achieving the consistent and accurate fire that they needed. So can our present-day gunners do any better? Just as their predecessors closed on the Armada, they too are hauling in their target to just 50 meters. Drake would have approved.
I saw the ball, or what I thought actually was a bit of the target flying off.
Oh, God, that's impossible.
War is hell, but this is worse. Firing at a fixed target at point-blank range, a fusillade of gunfire has brought just one tantalizing, possible strike.
I wonder whether it just kissed the top, which would give you a sound. Look. I'm right.
What?
Look.
It's either the narrowest of misses or a glancing hit. Nick knows which theory he favours.
And it gave a dong, didn't it?
It was definitely a dong.
I'm not just clutching at straws. I'm convinced the sound was right.
Yeah.
And I think that that bright piece of metal there on the front of that, well, the edge of that flange, and the bit of muck on that flange.
And then it went off to the right, didn't it?
I was going, that I was going to see a hole in the target because I just saw the ball. Most of the target was hidden by smoke, and I thought then, as the smoke cleared, I'd see a hole. And obviously we didn't. It's just a question of...
Oh, do you want me to...
No, I'm not going to fall.
There's only one way to prove it. Time to inspect the evidence close up.
Would I get down against nothing?
No, and then what is it? It's like
I thought that was some nice gunpowder fouling. That is from the forklift.
Right. Grease from the forks. More
I think I might have to retract.
How are you going to get down now?
I don't know.
400 years ago, the Elizabethan gunners were also left high and dry. They had put their faith in heavy guns like the Culverin, but that hadn't been enough.
Every generation has its new super weapon. They all think it's going to work wonderfully. They've all done trials. But when it comes to the real war, somehow things are different. Well, it was the same with their new heavy guns. It didn't work as well as they thought it was going to, and they were a long way from having worked out the most effective ways to use smooth-bore, muzzle-loading guns.
The Spanish were battered but unbroken. The English in good order but desperate for ammunition. No glorious victory, just a standoff.
It was essentially a draw. Neither had achieved what it wanted to achieve. The Spaniards hadn't landed in England, but equally, the English hadn't defeated the Spaniards. The Armada was still in good order, its discipline formation was intact, and it was still a very formidable force. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was in charge.
And Medina Sidonia was still determined to carry out the invasion plan. What settled matters was not the English, but the weather. An onshore wind now threatened imminently to break the Armada against the Dutch coast. But just when catastrophe seemed certain, the wind reversed direction and blew them back out to sea. To the Spanish, there was only one explanation: divine intervention.
The Spanish thought this change of wind was a miracle, but we can now see that a high pressure cell had developed and come in just at exactly the right moment for them. Produced southwest wind and that enabled them to escape into the North Sea.
But once in the North Sea, and with the wind behind them, there could be no going back for the Armada. Their invasion plans were put on hold. Now Medina Sidonia's priority was to get his Armada safely home to Spain, and there was only one way to do it: the long way round. This is the route that he set for his fleet, taking them north of Scotland and far out into the Atlantic before heading south and homewards. He was well aware of the dangers.
They were to make as much seaway into the Atlantic as they could so that they get a safe run southward to Spain. Because the great danger was to be caught by the prevailing westerly winds and dashed on the wild Atlantic coasts of Scotland and Ireland. And he took particular care to say, take great heed lest you fall upon the island of Ireland, for fear of the harm that might happen to you upon that coast.
Orders from Medina Sidonia were not to be taken lightly. He was a disciplinarian who had already executed one Armada captain for breaking formation. But despite his orders to stay clear of Ireland, within weeks, 3,000 of his men would end up dead on its shores. No one has ever questioned how that came to be. But now we can reveal new evidence that the Spanish were victims of a natural phenomenon, one which made it impossible to follow their commander's orders. Blooded but unbeaten, the Spanish Armada was heading homewards, forced by the weather to take the long northern passage out into the Atlantic. Medina Sidonia had given particular orders to stay clear of Ireland's dangerous coast. So how did a third of his fleet end up shipwrecked there? To search for clues, Ken Douglas has gone back to the ship's logs of the Armada. They reveal the disquiet of one man in particular, a senior officer called Marcos de Aramburu. Aramburu was an experienced and professional seafarer, and he left a detailed account of how, despite all his efforts to steer out into the Atlantic, he still ended up on the Irish coast.
This is Medina Sidonia's sailing instructions as we've seen. Marcos de Aramburu kept a careful log of his positions, and on certain dates he estimated how far west he had got. And on the 9th of September, he was at 54 degrees north. He estimated he was 360 miles west of Ireland. But on the 11th of September, after just 2 days sailing, he was on the Irish coast. It would have been impossible for him to sail that distance in 2 days. The implication's obvious. He was never as far west as he thought he was, so he could never have been out there.
So how had Aramburu ended up on the coast? Working back painstakingly from his landfall, Ken Douglas discovered that he had in fact been steering an erratic course 300 miles further east than he thought. He records soundings on the seabed which would have been impossible in the deep ocean. It's a colossal error of navigation. What could have brought the Spanish to make it?
The missing factor, in my view, is the North Atlantic Drift, the Gulf Stream. They didn't know it existed. They were navigating by dead reckoning, so that as they thought they were making headway westwards, they were in fact losing about 25 miles a day by not knowing to deduct the allowance for the North Atlantic Drift.
The Gulf Stream is one of the world's most powerful currents. Rising in the Gulf of Mexico, at its peak it's 5 times stronger than all the world's rivers combined. Even after reaching the British Isles, its energy remains formidable and, to the unwary, unpredictable.
I don't think that the Spanish would have had any concept that this current continued anything like as far north as it does. They might have been familiar with parts of this current further across the Atlantic from their voyages between Spain and the Americas, but it's most unlikely that they would have had any knowledge that this current carried this far north or retained this much strength at these latitudes.
How might the Gulf Stream have affected the Armada? For 10 full days in late August, bad weather blocked any progress southwards. Instead, as Aramburu's record shows, the Spanish tried to head out into the Atlantic. But with the Gulf Stream against them, any impression that they were making headway could well have been an illusion. When the wind finally turned on September the 3rd, they clearly felt confident that they could steer safely home to Spain. But if in fact they were further east, that fatal turn would bring them directly onto the coasts they had been trying to avoid. Ken's theory is new. No Armada history has ever questioned the Spaniards' navigation. But how plausible is it? The only way to find out is to put it to the test. Roger Proctor is an expert on ocean currents.
So we have to think about how fast the ship can actually sail into a current like this, with the fact also that there is wind and wave activity.
His computer model is more often used for tracking oil spills or drifting mines than 16th century warships.
And whether or not the ship can actually sail into that kind of...
And it would be losing ground.
And it would be losing ground. So it could actually be going backwards instead of going forwards as it thought it was.
Yes.
But by combining the observations of Aramburu with what we now know of weather and sea conditions, it may be possible to recreate the Armada's true course in September 1588.
Well, we've pretty well factored in most of these things now. So we have some idea of the currents due to the winds. Yeah. We have some idea of the winds themselves, the wind's directions, and we have some idea that the ship was sailing at the time.
It's not straightforward. In these northern waters, the Gulf Stream is constricted and flows at only half a knot. Wind speed and ocean depths also affected.
You know, with a 20-knot wind, if that could add an extra 0.4 of a knot to the current against the ship.
Yeah, I mean, one of the factors we have to be thoughtful about is the North Atlantic current is actually quite a narrow feature, so the positioning here is quite critical.
The first run-through isn't promising. It seems that Aramburu could have cleared Ireland easily.
The wind turns around and enables him to sail at a good speed down across the Rockall Bank, then misses Ireland completely. This assumes that the ship is actually fairly efficient in its sailing.
But this track is based on a first-rate sailing ship handling well. To reproduce the performance of the Spanish vessels, they will need to adjust the profile of the computer model.
Yeah, safely.
That's right.
So there could well be other ships coming in, drifted east, and they would be the ones that come down on the Irish coast.
They could be,
yeah.
As we know, the Spanish ships did not sail well against the wind.
So it's really down to the efficiency that the ship can sail when it's trying to batter its way through stormy conditions, really.
Many ships also had structural damage, and their crews were exhausted.
Because by the time these guys got this far west, they'd have been pretty much starving, in a pretty sorry state, weren't they?
Yes.
Their efficiency would have dropped off a lot.
Yes.
To reproduce the likely sailing qualities of Aramburu's ship, Roger makes one final adjustment. Then, 400 years on, the Spanish once again struggle against the Gulf Stream as they head for home.
In this calculation here, then, we're really assuming the captain is having difficulty sailing into the wind at all. He can't make it. So due south at the moment. In August 20th, before that.
It's quite surprising. That's not far away. Yeah, I could agree with that.
The effect of the current is slight but insidious, and over a period of time, deadly. In the grip of the Gulf Stream, Aramburu turns, as he thinks, for Spain. And despite a desperate struggle to avoid it, he is thrown onto a hostile shore.
Just brings it alive. I'm trying to work it out in my imagination, and there it is in real life. Well, you have to feel sorry for the crews who had already experienced a tremendous amount of privation. They'd suffered battle damage and they'd suffered heavy weather damage, and here they were out in seas, as they said themselves, almost unknown to them. And the fact is, they didn't know where they were. They must have felt completely lost.
In a matter of days, some 40 Spanish ships appeared on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. And once on the shoreline they had tried so hard to avoid, many found it impossible to get off again. They were pounded to pieces by storms. To this day, no one knows how many were lost. But almost half the ships that had sailed from Spain so proudly never returned. God blew, and they were scattered, reads the medal commemorating England's deliverance. Elizabeth, like Philip, put her faith in God, not men. But the Armada was not sunk by the weather alone, and certainly not by English gunfire. Those who died were victims of a colossal error of navigation, and of a natural phenomenon whose existence they never even suspected.